Okay, let's change and start moving our focus toward the Gospels, specifically the scholarship around the Gospels. We want to dive into these books. Sometimes we need to get a background on some of the other things that have been going on around these books. And so we're going to look at some scholarship issues around the Gospels. And there are a number of them, but we're only going to deal with two here specifically. The first is the issue of what's known as source criticism. Specifically, the question here is going to be like, what are the sources that the gospel writers use to get the gospels? Now, when we talk about this specifically, we're really going to talk about just three of the four gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And they're what's known as I'm sure you've heard this word before, the synoptics. Comes from the Greek synopsomai, which means to see together, but you can see it here, soon, together, optic, to see together. And so this was an issue that's brought up by J.J. Griesbach in his 1774 work, Synopse, and he's kind of getting there and saying, hey, how do we explain the fact that these three gospels share a lot in common, but they also have some very, very distinct differences? And that's really what the synoptic problem, it's what's referred to as the synoptic problem. Problem is just how a different way of, we wouldn't say it's a problem, but this is just the question. How do we explain the fact that they're so similar and yet they have those differences? So what's the relation of these three gospels together? Now, some have tried to argue that there is no relationship between the three, that they're completely literarily independent. But the problem is, that's just going to be difficult to maintain considering the verbal parallels, the tenses, the way those tenses are paralleled in different ways, the way they're structured. It's just very difficult to maintain that. It's not impossible, but it's not the most likely explanation there. So, additionally, when we start thinking about the fact that we have verbal agreement in translations of Jesus' words from Aramaic, how do we explain that? Because if you've ever seen two people start translating something, you understand they can translate it in some very different ways sometimes. Unique nuances and things. So how do we explain that? So this is the issue we've got to come down to. So I've brought this up and I've posted this online. This is a parallel of Mark 2, Matthew 9, and Luke chapter 5. It's under the course documents here. And here's what I want us to see. I've highlighted in yellow here just one verse. I mean, you can look at this whole thing and do this, but that would have gotten a lot more complicated. So let's just bring it down to one verse, or two verses really. It's in Mark chapter 2, verses 10 and 11, Matthew chapter 9, verse 6, and then in Luke chapter 5, verse 24. And what I want us to see here is that there's a remarkable amount of overlap and agreement here. So if you look here, you'll see that on these, the words highlighted in yellow are the exact same across Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So you know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. They all have that. Then the next part has a little bit of a disagreement here. Mark and Matthew both say, then he said. But the interesting part about said there is it's actually it's a historical present. So it'd be like, and he is saying. And so it's this weird thing in Greek where you can use the present tense to convey a past action, and it gives it a kind of a liveliness to it. So, and he was saying to the paralytic. Now, then we get Mark and Luke both say, I say to you, while Matthew doesn't include that at all. So you can see that there's some interesting parallels and distinctions between those three. I encourage you can go in, you can look at that, kind of work through that, and see, okay, this is how these Gospels do. And you can actually go find parallels of those Gospels. You can get parallels where they'll put all of those together, if that really interests you as well. And it's one of the things that when we can say, okay, now we have to say, that's a very unique reality. How do we explain that? So, source criticism here historically has looked at the way that those writers have taken those literary unions and put them together in the Gospels. Now, there have been some different proposals. Let's just throw these out here just so you kind of have an idea of what's going on. There's a man named G.E. Lessing. It's actually published posthumously here, but he believed that there was something called an Ur-Gospel. Ur there means an original and a first gospel that existed there, and that it was this Ur-Gospel was what existed, and it existed in Aramaic, and it was translated over, potentially in Hebrew as well. The problem is, if it has an Ur-Gospel, if this does exist, we have no existing format. We have no existing thing that we could point to that this actually did ever exist. So, kind of convenient if you can posit something, but you can't prove that it ever did exist. On the other hand, it is difficult in some ways to maintain this because of the way that those verbal parallels, again, if they're translating from a different language over, the parallels are difficult in some ways to explain. So, that's one. Another one, a particular one by J.G. Herder. Again, we're talking centuries ago. Lessing is writing a couple centuries ago. Herder believed what's called a common dependence on oral sources. Common dependence on oral sources. He believed that there was a relatively fixed oral summary of the life of Christ, which, again, we understand that there was oral tradition and there were certain things like that. But if it did, the shape and the content and the context and all those things are absolutely unknowable to us. We can't know that what any of that would have looked like. It's kind of like we find. It kind of be like saying, "Hey, we found a written tradition of a fairy tale." Let's just say a fairy tale out there, and then trying to go back and reconstruct. Well, let's just say there are multiple versions of that fairy tale, and go back and reconstruct the oral phase of it. That's almost an impossible thing to do there. So. On top of that, we also know and we can see that there was a very intense effort to write down a lot of this. So understanding the oral sources there is kind of there. It's going to be a bit problematic. And one more here we'll look at just briefly before we turn to some more recent ones. It's by a man named Friedrich Schleiermacher. And his position was we had several fragments that existed in written form, and they were gradually incorporated into the Gospels. So let's say there were fragments. Let's just call him the fragments one there. Now, we can understand that there were multiple written sources, but the manner in which Schleiermacher means this is ultimately understood. It's just not sustainable that these kind of coalesce in this sort of way. It just doesn't work. And so it's actually, this one sort of falls off because they realize historically understanding that those fragments existed, and they explain that they would have been put together in the way that they finally are. It's just not as possible. So where do we go from here? These aren't ultimately satisfying. one of the way that we now typically approach the synoptics is through what we call a theory of interdependence. Okay? Interdependence. This means that two or more of the Gospels, those Gospel writers use one or more of the Gospels as their source. Okay, this means that the Gospels actually use each other in some way. They're related to one another. Now, to understand interdependence, we need to understand how these Gospels tend to show up with one another. And for the key here, Mark, the Gospel of Mark tends to be the middle term. Okay? Mark and Matthew will often agree against Luke. Mark and Luke will agree against Matthew. But it's very rare that Luke and Matthew agree against Mark. And so if you think about this, you often have Mark and Matthew agreeing, but not Luke. You'll have Mark and Luke agreeing, but not Matthew. It doesn't mean they're contradicting each other. It means that things are put together a certain way or listed out, and we can talk about that later. And so we understand that's a central issue we're going to have to deal with first. So this leads to the question, who wrote first? How do we understand it? According to Augustine, he believed that Matthew wrote first, and Mark borrowed from Matthew, and Luke borrowed from both. Okay, that's a possibility here. The difficulty we run into is that, as we'll talk, it's very unlikely that when you do something, you shorten it, you don't end up in the way it looks there. Another hypothesis is that Matthew wrote first and Luke borrowed from Matthew and Mark depended on both of them. That's a potential way. Okay. But in scholarship now, when we talk about the Gospels, you often hear this, and here's where a lot of people will go. It's what's known as the two-source hypothesis. And these two sources we have are Mark and plus something called Q, or it stands for Quelle. Mark and Q. Now, interestingly, this is first proposed by Friedrich Schleiermacher here. And he says Q here is a sayings source. It's something there. And the reason for this proposal is that we often, again, have doublets or things that are similar word order that show up. So we do have this source that appears that floats out there. And the difference we have is that what's sometimes labeled as Q material floats. It's sometimes incorporated in Matthean discourses while Luke scatters it throughout. And so we don't exactly know what's out there. But the main reason for proposing something like a Q, a source, a document here, is we have to explain the 250 verses that are in Matthew and Luke, but are not in Mark. Okay? So the thought is, well, we can see if Mark is shorter, if he wrote first, Matthew and Luke seem to have borrowed from him. But it also seems that there's something else out here that's going to account for these 250 verses that they share in common. So where is this coming from? So that's where we're going. And it's a reasonable assumption. Here's the thing. We can't say much about Q. It's a hypothesis at best. We have something out there that's accounting for these 250 verses showing up that match here in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. So we don't exactly know what's going on there. And so that's just where we're kind of making an assumption. On the other side, what we have is we understand that the gospel authors absolutely did use sources. In fact, as Luke says, as many have undertaken to write these things. So Luke is absolutely assuredly writing using sources. He knows these things are out there. He's saying, look, many have undertaken. I'm writing this gospel in most consecutive order. And so this is what's going on here. And that's the hypothesis, right? There's some source out there that's helping explain these other 250 verses. We're not going to be dogmatic about it. We can't say much about Q. We have no idea what's in there aside from if maybe these 250 verses, but there's nothing else we can say about it. So we don't want to push it beyond that. Now, one of the things that we're going to have to deal with is if that is true, then we're assuming that Mark wrote first. Up until the 19th century, most people assume that Matthew wrote first. They're drawing on a quote from Papias, quoted by Eusebius there in the 3rd century. The problem is Mark's brevity seems to say Mark wrote first. All right, 97% of Mark's words have a parallel in Matthew, and 88% of his words have a parallel in Luke. So, is it more likely that Matthew and Luke looked at Mark and expanded Mark, or that Mark looked at Matthew and Luke and condensed them? The problem is, while it's not impossible that he condensed them, the reality is when you condense, you often lose a lot of stuff. That's just not something that we see. You lose a certain number of things, and that produces a different condensation there. So it looks stylistically more likely that Mark writes first, and we're going to assume that, and then Luke and Matthew write later, and we'll talk about their dates as well when we get to them. So, again, excuse me, when we're talking about this area of scholarship, none of this is a guarantee, but this is our best kind of explanation for how we get from point A to point B. Now let's talk about a secondary issue. The life of Christ. Specifically, an issue that happens within scholarship, particularly in the 18th century, 18th and 19th century, about how do we deal with the life of the historical person of Jesus? How do we deal with that? What do we do with that? So, prior to the 18th century, most gospel scholarship focused around harmonizing the Gospels. That was a big thing that they did. However, beginning in then, it's not that that's unhelpful, it's just that there was a lot of other questions that existed. And so we get what's often known as the quest for the historical Jesus. Now, when we talk about the quest for historical Jesus, it's not one quest. It's actually three. It's actually three quests. So the first quest, what happens here, it starts with a guy, after the Enlightenment, historians were less inclined to accept the gospel accounts of what is they're saying there about Jesus, and so they start looking for other things here. And so they're going to start stripping out a lot of this miraculous. Who's this historical Jesus? Not the Christ and everybody. Who's this historical Jesus? And so this starts off with something that's actually published posthumously by a guy named Samuel Reimarus. And it's published posthumously, but it's what's known as his Fragments, and it's published between 1774 and 1778. Okay? He suggested that the resurrection did not occur. The disciples just stole the body. And others followed along this rationalistic approach. And what we start seeing is this becomes a pattern. D.F. Strauss, he rejected the historicity of the Gospels, but believed that there were philosophical and religious truths in there. And so the task became, how do we find the true historical Jesus who lived and strip out the miraculous parts, a very Enlightenment kind of thing to you. Effectively, the Christ of the church, with all the theology and the dogma, had to be removed, and we needed to find this, as he called it, the humble Jesus of Nazareth. What happens here is this leads to what's known as, we saw his name before, but this is G.E. Lessing. It's what's known as Lessing's ditch. He said that there is a ditch between history and eternal truths that cannot be crossed. Effectively, he said, there's a Jesus of history, that's what they want to get at, and there's a Christ of faith, and those are two different people. And that's what comes to dominate this first quest specifically. And so we start seeing cracks in this. The way this plays out, Martin Collar, they start distinguishing between historical facts and salvation history and the preaching and all these things start doing here. This kind of comes to an end with two things. The first one is by a man named William Vrede. We'll see him again. But he writes the Messianic Secret in Mark, and he's kind of pulling on this that there's a Messianic secret. That's because this didn't exist at that time. Jesus was not, he was a regular guy, and the churches later brought this deity upon him. And so that's where Vrede goes, and he kind of takes it as far as he goes, and it finally gets kind of blown up by a guy named Albert Schweitzer. Schweitzer comes along. He writes The Quest for the Historical Jesus, a critical study of its progress from Reimarus to Vrede. And he writes this in 1906. And Schweitzer basically goes on and he says, you know what? First half of his book, he says, the historical Jesus that all these authors are doing is really just a projection of their own philosophical worldviews. If you're a real pacifist, Jesus is a real pacifist. If you're a social warrior, Jesus is a social warrior. We see this played out today too. There's a mirror reading. You're finding the Jesus you want to find. And so he's calling him out on it. Jesus looks a lot like you want him to look like, and you're basically picking and choosing what you think is authentic and what you think isn't. And then what he goes on to do, and what kind of, if you've ever been at a party and somebody or there's a joke and somebody takes it way too far and everybody's like, we're done. That's what he does in the second half of his work. He says, no, eschatology is the key. End times is the key. And so Jesus understood himself to be this end times figure. And so Jesus was proclaiming the coming world-ending in-breaking of the kingdom of God, and he died disappointed that it had not happened yet. Everybody looks at this and say, we're done. That basically kills this first quest. After Schweitzer writes this, there's nobody who basically comes along and does anything with this, okay? That kind of kills it, and it moves on. So there's our first quest. And then we have a period of what's called the period of no quest. From about 1910 to 1950-ish, there's nothing happening. Well, there's groundwork being laid, but this is not a flourishing endeavor. And so what you've got in this stage, Rudolf Bultmann sets the stage through what's called form criticism. And basically, while Bultmann is the most influential New Testament scholar of the 20th century, he's not a good guy for us. He was convinced that we can know very little about Jesus, but the accounts we have are so thoroughly reinterpreted by the church, we can't actually know much about Jesus. And so he does a lot of things here, and what he does, one of his big contributions is going to set the stage here, is he says, okay, look, what we need to do is reinterpret the scriptures, is what he'll do. And he says, we can't know much about Jesus because it's buried in this corn husk. So if you imagine a piece of corn, again, I can't draw, and here's the kernel. All of this husk is all the theology, all the stuff that's in there. And so what we need to do is get to this kernel. And what Bultmann basically does is says we have to reinterpret it all through existentialist philosophy. We don't have a time to get to that. And so what he's doing is he's setting the stage for some of his students, particularly a man by the name, in the Second Quest in the 50s, by the name of Ernst Käsemann. K-A-S-E, Käsemann. And Ernst Käsemann, that's right, let's get the... comes along. He sought to take form criticism. Okay, how do we get back to the original story? How do we peel back all these layers and get back to that original, that kernel? And he thought we could use scientifically rigorous methodology to kind of separate the Greek parts from the Hebrew parts. We could separate it all out. And the Greek would be the later additions, while that Hebrew would be the original parts. And so what he was doing is really trying to get, again, back to this kernel. What is that central beginning point that they had? Now, Käsemann is doing this around 1953. All right? That's when he kind of burst on the scene there. The interesting part is the death knell for this form criticism and Second Quest for the Historical Jesus was already discovered. It's in Qumran with the Dead Sea Scrolls, because in Qumran, what was interesting, they thought, hey, we could easily say, here's the Greek stuff, here's the Hebrew stuff, we separate it out. What was interesting is Qumran is a 2nd century Jewish separatist sect. And all of a sudden, when they got to this 2nd century sect, they looked at it and they said, wait, there are a lot of Greek Hellenistic elements here in this Jewish separatist sect that's saying, wait, maybe this isn't as clean as we thought it was going to be. And so this second quest sort of falls flat, because we realize we're not going to be able to separate it. We're not going to be able to use form criticism to do it there. And so it falls flat. Now, more recently, we'll have what's called the third quest. And there are a couple of things here that are interesting. The third quest for the historical Jesus. Specifically, we have a couple of things. One is the Jesus Seminar. They vote on what they think are the original sayings of Jesus and what aren't. I imagine that's very democratic of them. But then the other part that really comes to understand the third quest for the historical Jesus is understanding Jesus in a Palestinian context. And And so you get guys like John Dominic Crossan, etc. And they want to place Jesus in this ancient Near East kind of milieu. Not a bad in and of itself. The problem is this third quest again falls prey to some of the things that the first and second quest did. Is that it doesn't take the text itself as authoritative and sufficient for understanding and knowing who Jesus is. And so this is where we end up with the third quest there. And we can go through and we can talk through those. But one of the things is we talk about gospel studies, understanding that there are a significant number of people who say, well, here's what the text is, but we don't believe this is sufficient to know who Jesus is. And this is where we're going to be different. We're going to say, no. The text is sufficient. The text is authoritative. So, as we talk about getting into the Gospels, that's one of the main things we're going to have to keep in mind. That the Gospels give us a picture of Jesus, and we're going to say it is a sufficient and authoritative and accurate picture because we don't have a Christ of faith and a Jesus history. Those two are united in this person. And what we see in the Gospels is the early church, specifically these Gospel writers, helping us understand how those two come together in Him. So that's what we're going to look at as we dive into the Gospels, some of their major themes, but also as we seek to move forward. We just need to know that these things are out there, and so we can engage them and move forward.